My ex-wife's lawyer smirked when I showed up in jeans and work boots until I pulled out a manila envelope that made him go silent in front of the entire courtroom. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish and recycled air when I walked in at 9:43 a.m., wearing my work clothes because I'd come straight from a job site. My ex-wife Diane sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal designer suit that probably cost more than my truck payment, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while her lawyer, some guy named Jeffrey Ashworth from a downtown firm, leaned over to whisper something that made her nod bravely. Jeffrey looked up when I walked through the doors, took in my steel-toed boots and the sawdust still clinging to my jeans, and his mouth curved into this slow, satisfied smile like Christmas had come early. He adjusted his $400 tie and said something to his paralegal that made her laugh behind her hand. I caught the word typical and knew exactly what he meant. Typical blue-collar guy who couldn't even bother to dress appropriately for court. Typical construction worker who probably didn't understand how badly he was about to get destroyed. I sat down at the defendant's table alone because I'd told my lawyer I'd handle this part myself, and I set my worn canvas messenger bag on the floor beside my chair. Jeffrey noticed I didn't have an attorney with me, and his smirk got even wider. I'd been married to Diane for 11 years when she filed for divorce 8 months ago, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting full custody of our 2 kids, plus substantial alimony and child support. We'd met when I was 26, working as a construction supervisor on a commercial build downtown, and she was a receptionist at a dental office who'd smiled at me when I came in for a cleaning. She'd seemed sweet and genuine, laughing at my jokes and asking about my work like she actually cared. We got married after dating for a year and a half, bought a small house in the suburbs, and had our daughter, Emma. Wait, I can't use that name. Had our daughter, Sophie, when I was 28, and our son, Lucas, when I was 30. I worked my way up from supervisor to foreman to eventually starting my own small contracting company, taking on residential remodels and custom builds. The money was good, but inconsistent, and Diane had quit her receptionist job after Sophie was born, saying she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. For years, everything seemed fine. Not perfect, but fine. We had the usual married couple arguments about money and kids and household chores, but nothing that seemed catastrophic. Diane handled the family finances because she said I was too busy with work, and I trusted her to pay the bills and manage our accounts. She was good at it, keeping detailed spreadsheets and always knowing exactly how much we had and where it was going. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to those spreadsheets. I should have noticed the early signs that something was off, like how Diane started dressing nicer about 2 years ago, buying expensive clothes she said were from consignment stores, or how she joined a gym that cost $180 a month when we had a perfectly good basement where she could work out for free, or how she started going out for girls' nights 3 or 4 times a week, coming home after midnight smelling like expensive wine and making jokes about how I wouldn't understand because I was always covered in drywall dust. The first real red flag I couldn't ignore came about 18 months ago when I tried to transfer some money from our savings account to cover an equipment purchase for a big job I'd landed. The transfer was rejected because there wasn't enough money in the account. I called the bank thinking it was an error, and they told me the savings account that should have had around $35,000 in it actually had $412. I went home and asked Diane about it, trying to keep my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. She'd looked at me with these wide, innocent eyes and explained that she'd moved most of the money to a different account that had a better interest rate. She said she'd been planning to tell me, but kept forgetting. She pulled up her laptop and showed me an account statement showing $34,600 in some high-yield savings account I'd never heard of. The numbers looked right, so I believed her. I told myself she was just being financially savvy, and I should be grateful she was paying attention to this stuff. But then other things started happening. Credit cards appeared that I hadn't applied for. Our mortgage payment was mysteriously late twice, resulting in fees that Diane blamed on bank processing errors. She started receiving packages several times a week, expensive items from Nordstrom and Saks, and when I asked about them, she'd get defensive and say she deserved to have nice things after spending all day taking care of the kids and the house. She was right that she worked hard, so I let it go. I was working 60-hour weeks trying to grow my business, trying to provide for my family, and I didn't have the energy to fight about shopping habits. I told myself that as long as the bills were getting paid and we weren't going into debt, it was fine. Diane could spend money on herself if she wanted to. The second red flag came about a year ago when Sophie, who was 10 at the time, mentioned something about Mom's friend David who came over sometimes when I was at work. She said it casually while I was helping her with homework, just mentioned that David had brought pizza for lunch one day and had played video games with her and Lucas. I asked Diane about it that night, trying to sound casual and not accusatory, asking who David was. Diane had laughed and said he was just a guy from her book club who'd stopped by to drop off some books they were reading. She said Sophie was exaggerating about the pizza and video games, that he'd just been there for 10 minutes. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was too horrible to consider, but I started paying more attention after that. Started noticing that Diane would sometimes change clothes in the middle of the day when she thought I wouldn't notice. Started seeing text messages flash on her phone from someone named D that she'd quickly dismiss when I was nearby. I hired a private investigator named Thomas Kelly 3 months before Diane filed for divorce. He'd been in investigations for 19 years, mostly corporate fraud cases, but he also did domestic work. I gave him Diane's information and asked him to follow her for 2 weeks, just to confirm what I was increasingly afraid was true. The photos he brought back were worse than I'd imagined. Diane wasn't just having an affair. She was living an entire second life. The man she was seeing was named David Langford, and he was a pharmaceutical sales representative who drove a BMW and lived in a luxury condo downtown. The photos showed Diane meeting him at restaurants I couldn't afford, getting into his car in parking garages, entering his building, and not leaving for hours. Thomas had documented 23 separate meetings over the 2-week period, and that was just what he'd been able to capture. But the affair wasn't even the worst part. While Thomas was investigating Diane's movements, I'd started digging into our finances on my own. I created new logins for all our bank accounts using my email address instead of Diane's, and what I found made my stomach drop. The high-yield savings account she'd shown me a year ago didn't exist. The account statement she'd pulled up had been fake, probably created using some online template. Our actual savings had been systematically drained over the past 3 years, with withdrawals and transfers going to accounts I didn't recognize. I found credit cards in my name that I'd never opened, maxed out to their limits. I found a home equity line of credit for $80,000 that had been taken out against our house and completely spent. All told, Diane had stolen or spent approximately $175,000 of our family's money over 3 years, and I hadn't noticed because I'd trusted her to handle the finances. I consulted with a divorce attorney named Patricia Novak, who'd been practicing family law for 26 years and had a reputation for being tough but fair. I showed her everything: the bank statements, the credit card bills, the investigator's photos, the fake account statement Diane had created. Patricia reviewed it all with this grim expression and then told me something that made my blood run cold. She said that in our state, marital debt acquired during the marriage was typically split 50-50 in a divorce, regardless of who actually incurred it. That meant I could be held responsible for half of the debt Diane had racked up, even though I'd had no knowledge of it and hadn't benefited from any of the spending. She said my best bet was to file for divorce first, citing the financial fraud and the affair, and requesting full custody of the kids based on Diane's deceptive behavior and poor judgment. I was planning to file the paperwork the following week, but Diane beat me to it. She filed first, with Jeffrey Ashworth representing her, and the petition she submitted painted me as a neglectful workaholic husband who'd emotionally abandoned his family. She claimed I'd been verbally abusive, which was a complete lie. She claimed I'd mismanaged our finances and hidden money from her, which was projection of the highest order. She requested primary custody of Sophie and Lucas, claiming I was too busy with work to properly care for them. She requested alimony of $4,500 per month plus child support of $2,800 per month, amounts that would have bankrupted me and destroyed the business I'd spent years building. And she filed for emergency orders to freeze all our assets and prevent me from accessing our joint accounts, effectively leaving me with no money to fight her. The emergency hearing for the asset freeze was brutal. Jeffrey showed up in his expensive suit with a briefcase full of documents painting me as a deadbeat who was trying to hide marital assets. He had bank statements showing transfers I'd made from our joint account to my business account, which I'd done legitimately to pay for equipment and materials for jobs. He made it sound like I was siphoning money away from my family. He had statements from Diane about how I worked all the time and never helped with the kids, conveniently leaving out that I was working those hours to provide for us. The judge, a woman named Honor Constance Whitfield, who'd been on the bench for 15 years, listened to Jeffrey's presentation and granted the freeze. Just like that, I couldn't access any of our money except for a small checking account that had $3,200 in it, barely enough to cover my truck payment and groceries for a month. I went back to Patricia and told her we needed to fight this hard and fast. She agreed and started building our case. We subpoenaed all of Diane's financial records, her phone records, her email accounts. We hired a forensic accountant named Douglas Montgomery who specialized in uncovering hidden assets and financial fraud. Douglas had 32 years of experience and had worked on major embezzlement cases. He spent 3 weeks going through every transaction in every account Diane had access to, tracing where the money had gone and what it had been spent on. What he found was damning. Diane had opened 7 different credit cards in my name without my knowledge. She'd taken out that home equity line and spent it on vacations with David, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and a down payment on a condo she was planning to buy with him. She'd forged my signature on loan applications and credit card agreements. She'd systematically stolen from our family to fund an affair and a lifestyle I knew nothing about. We also subpoenaed David Langford as a witness, and his deposition was enlightening. David claimed he'd had no idea Diane was married for the first 6 months of their relationship. He said she'd told him she was divorced and that I was just her ex-husband who she co-parented with. He said he'd only found out the truth when he'd seen a family photo at our house one day, when he'd picked Diane up and realized we were still very much married and living together. Instead of ending the affair then, he'd just become more careful about when and where they met. He admitted to expensive dinners, weekend trips to resort towns, shopping sprees where he'd bought Diane things she'd claimed she needed because her ex-husband wasn't paying adequate support. He'd spent approximately $45,000 on her over 18 months, money that came from his sales commissions and bonuses. The preliminary hearings before the final divorce trial were a disaster for my case, at least on the surface. Jeffrey was good at his job, and he knew how to work a courtroom. He'd present Diane as this long-suffering wife who'd been neglected by her workaholic husband, who'd had to manage the entire household alone, who'd made some financial mistakes because she was stressed and overwhelmed. He'd gloss over the affair, making it sound like a brief lapse in judgment that happened because she was emotionally vulnerable. He'd hammer on my work hours, on times I'd missed school events because I was on a job site, on the fact that I sometimes came home late covered in dust and too tired to do anything but eat and sleep. He made it sound like I was a terrible father and husband, and Judge Whitfield seemed to be buying it. At one hearing, Jeffrey brought in a child psychologist named Dr. Rebecca Sterling, who'd done a custody evaluation. Dr. Sterling had interviewed Sophie and Lucas separately, and according to her report, both kids said they loved both parents, but felt closer to Mom because she was home more. The report made me sound distant and disconnected, which killed me because I loved my kids more than anything. I was working those long hours for them, to build a business that could provide for their future, to make sure they had everything they needed. But Jeffrey spun it like I cared more about work than family, and Dr. Sterling's report seemed to support that narrative. Judge Whitfield ordered temporary custody to Diane pending the final trial, with me getting the kids every other weekend. Going from seeing my children every day to seeing them 4 days a month felt like having my chest carved open. Jeffrey also brought in financial records showing that my business had recently had some significant income, making it look like I was flush with cash and could easily afford the alimony and child support Diane was requesting. What he conveniently left out was that most of that income had already been spent on materials and subcontractor labor for the jobs I'd completed, and that my actual profit margin was much smaller than the gross revenue suggested. He made me look like I was hiding money when really I was barely keeping my business afloat while paying for this divorce and trying to cover the debts Diane had left me with. The final trial was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in October, and I'd spent the night before going over everything with Patricia one more time. She'd organized our evidence into thick binders with tabs and exhibits, everything labeled and cross-referenced. We had the forensic accountant's report showing Diane's fraud. We had the investigator's photos of the affair. We had David's deposition. We had the fake account statement Diane had shown me. We had credit card agreements with my forged signature. We had proof of everything Diane had done, and Patricia was confident we could destroy her case and Jeffrey's narrative completely. But when I showed up that morning in my work boots and jeans, having come straight from checking on a job site that was running behind schedule, I realized Jeffrey had one more trick up his sleeve. He was going to use my appearance against me. The way he looked at me when I walked in, the smirk on his face, the whispered comments to his paralegal, it all clicked into place. He was going to paint me as exactly what I looked like in that moment. A working-class guy who couldn't even be bothered to dress appropriately for court, who probably couldn't understand complex financial documents, who was in over his head against a sophisticated legal team. He was going to use every stereotype about blue-collar workers against me, and Judge Whitfield, in her expensive robe and with her law degree from Yale, might just believe it. The trial started with Jeffrey's opening statement, and it was exactly as calculated as I'd feared. He talked about Diane as a devoted mother and wife who'd sacrificed her career to raise her children. He talked about me as a man who'd prioritized work over family, who'd been emotionally absent, who'd mismanaged finances, and then tried to blame his wife for his own failures. He gestured at me sitting there in my work clothes and said something about how I couldn't even respect the court enough to dress appropriately. What did that say about my respect for my marriage vows or my responsibilities as a father? A few people in the gallery murmured, and I saw Judge Whitfield glance at me with what might have been disapproval. Patricia gave her opening statement next, outlining what we intended to prove: systematic financial fraud, adultery, forgery, and deception. She was professional and thorough, but I could tell the room was still focused on Jeffrey's narrative. She looked polished in her suit, but Jeffrey looked more polished. His firm had more resources, more prestige, more credibility with judges like Whitfield, who'd come from the same elite legal circles. We were the underdogs here, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Jeffrey called his first witness, Diane, and she was perfect. She'd clearly been coached extensively on how to testify. She cried at the right moments. She looked at me with hurt and disappointment when she talked about how I'd changed over the years, becoming cold and distant. She admitted to the affair, but framed it as a mistake, born from loneliness and neglect. She claimed the financial issues were misunderstandings, that she'd tried to tell me about the accounts and the credit cards, but I'd been too busy to listen. She said the forged signatures must have been mistakes, that maybe she'd signed my name on documents thinking she had permission, or maybe the bank had made errors in their records. It was all lies, delivered with perfect sincerity, and I watched the judge taking notes and nodding occasionally. On cross-examination, Patricia pressed her on specifics. When exactly had she tried to tell me about the credit cards? Diane couldn't give a specific answer. What were the dates of the conversations where she'd allegedly told me about the accounts? Diane said she couldn't remember exactly, but it had definitely happened. Patricia showed her the fake bank statement she'd created and asked if she'd made it. Diane claimed she'd gotten it from the bank and didn't know it was fake, that maybe the bank had made an error. Patricia asked about the $80,000 home equity line, and Diane said she'd told me about it, that I must have forgotten. Every answer was calculated to create just enough doubt that maybe, possibly, there'd been miscommunication rather than fraud. Jeffrey called David Langford next, and David was clearly uncomfortable being there. He confirmed the affair, but downplayed it, making it sound shorter and less serious than it actually was. He claimed Diane had told him from the beginning that her marriage was over in all but name, that I was just a roommate she was co-parenting with while she figured out the divorce. He admitted to spending money on her but characterized it as gifts between consenting adults, nothing unusual or wrong. On cross-examination, Patricia got him to admit that he'd continued the affair even after learning Diane and I were still very much married and living together, but he claimed he'd believed Diane when she said she was planning to leave me soon. The trial broke for lunch, and I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Patricia going over the afternoon's plan. She was going to call Douglas the forensic accountant to walk through the financial fraud in detail, and then Thomas the investigator to present the surveillance evidence. She said we had them, that the evidence was overwhelming, but I could see doubt in her eyes. She'd seen enough trials to know that evidence didn't always matter as much as presentation, and Jeffrey was out-presenting us at every turn. I ate a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and tried not to think about losing my kids. When we returned to the courtroom, I noticed Jeffrey conferring with Diane in whispered tones, and both of them kept glancing at me with those same smug expressions. Whatever they were planning, they thought they'd already won. Judge Whitfield came back and called the court to order, and Patricia stood to call her first witness. That's when I leaned over and whispered to her that I needed to testify first, before the accountant. She looked at me like I was crazy, and whispered back that we'd agreed I'd testify last, after we'd established the foundation with expert testimony. I shook my head and told her to trust me on this. She hesitated, clearly thinking I was making a huge mistake, but then she nodded and called me to the stand instead. I walked up to the witness box in my work boots, and I could feel every eye in the courtroom on me, judging. Jeffrey was practically grinning. I was sworn in, and Patricia started with basic questions. My name, my occupation, how long I'd been married to Diane. I answered clearly and calmly, making eye contact with Judge Whitfield. Then Patricia asked me about my work schedule, and I explained that yes, I worked long hours, but that was what it took to run a small business and provide for a family. I talked about the jobs I'd completed, the employees I'd hired, the reputation I'd built in the community for quality work. I made it clear that I wasn't just some guy who chose work over family. I was a business owner trying to build something lasting for my children's future. Then Patricia asked about the finances, and I explained how I'd trusted Diane completely, how she'd handled all our accounts and bills because I was busy with work. I walked through discovering the missing savings, the fake account statement, the credit cards I'd never opened. I pulled out copies of the forged documents from my canvas bag and handed them to the clerk to be entered as evidence. I explained how I'd hired the investigator and the forensic accountant, how I'd discovered the full extent of what had been done. I kept my voice steady and factual, no emotion, just laying out the timeline of discovery. Jeffrey's cross-examination was brutal. He hammered on the work hours, trying to get me to admit I'd been absent from my kids' lives. He asked if I'd really never noticed $175,000 disappearing, suggesting I was either lying about not knowing or too incompetent to manage money. He pointed at my work clothes and asked if I understood that this was a court of law requiring a certain level of respect and decorum. I answered every question calmly, explaining that I'd come straight from a job site because I had employees counting on me to keep the business running, that I couldn't afford to take a whole day off when I was paying for this divorce and covering the debts my ex-wife had left me with. I said the clothes I was wearing were honest work clothes, and I wasn't ashamed of honest work. When Jeffrey finally finished, looking smug like he'd scored major points, Patricia asked if she could redirect. Judge Whitfield nodded, looking bored. Patricia asked me one simple question. Mr. Barrett, do you have any additional evidence to present to the court? I nodded and reached into my canvas bag, pulling out a manila envelope I'd been carrying since I'd walked into the courtroom that morning. I handed it to the clerk and asked that it be marked as Exhibit M. The clerk took it with a curious expression and passed it to the judge. Judge Whitfield opened the envelope and pulled out the contents, and I watched her face change from bored to shocked in the span of about 3 seconds. Inside that envelope were 3 things. First, a complete forensic accounting report from Douglas Montgomery, but not the one we'd already submitted. This was a supplementary report he'd finished just 2 days ago, after getting access to some accounts we'd only recently discovered. The report showed that Diane hadn't just stolen $175,000 from our family. She'd actually stolen closer to $290,000 over 4 years, and she'd hidden the extra money in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under her sister's name. Douglas had found it by tracing a pattern of wire transfers that Diane had made to what looked like a consulting business, but was actually a shell company her sister had set up to help hide the money. Second, there were bank statements for that offshore account, showing a current balance of $127,000. Diane had been planning to leave the country with David and take that money with her, leaving me with all the debt and no resources to fight for custody. The statements showed transfers dated within the past 6 months, some as recent as 3 weeks ago, long after she'd filed for divorce and claimed she had no money. Third, and most damning, there were text messages between Diane and her sister discussing the plan in explicit detail. Messages about how to structure the offshore account to avoid detection. Messages about forging my signature on documents. Messages about how Diane planned to take him for everything he's worth in the divorce while keeping the hidden money for herself. Messages about how she was coaching Sophie and Lucas to say things that would make me look like a bad father in the custody evaluation. Messages about how Jeffrey had assured her they could destroy my credibility by making me look like an uneducated construction worker who couldn't possibly understand complex financial matters. Judge Whitfield read through everything slowly, her expression getting darker with every page. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Jeffrey's smirk had vanished, replaced by panic as he tried to lean over and see what the judge was reading. Diane had gone pale, her eyes darting between me and the judge and her lawyer. Patricia sat beside me with her arms crossed, and I could see the smallest smile at the corner of her mouth. We'd held this evidence back deliberately, waiting for Jeffrey to commit fully to his strategy of underestimating me, letting him think he had this case won before we pulled the rug out from under him. Judge Whitfield finally looked up from the documents and fixed Diane with a stare that could have cut glass. "Mrs. Barrett, did you create or participate in the creation of an offshore account for the purpose of hiding marital assets?" Her voice was cold and formal, and Diane's lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off. "Your client is under oath, Mr. Ashworth. She'll answer the question." Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked at Jeffrey desperately, but he was frantically flipping through papers in his briefcase, trying to figure out how badly this had just destroyed their case. Finally, Diane whispered that she'd like to invoke her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitfield banged her gavel and called for order, then announced that we were taking a recess and she wanted both attorneys in her chambers immediately. Patricia gathered her things and followed the judge out, leaving me sitting at the defendant's table watching Diane and Jeffrey have a heated, whispered argument. I could see Diane crying, and this time they weren't the practiced, sympathetic tears from earlier. These were real tears of panic, because she knew she'd been caught. Jeffrey looked like he wanted to throw his briefcase across the room. His paralegal was frantically typing on her laptop, probably researching whether they could somehow spin this. The recess lasted 90 minutes, and when Patricia came back, she had news. Judge Whitfield had informed both parties that she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution of Diane for fraud, forgery, and perjury. The divorce proceedings would continue, but in light of the new evidence, the judge was immediately reversing the temporary custody order and granting me primary physical custody of Sophie and Lucas, effective immediately. Diane would get supervised visitation pending a new custody evaluation, and there would be a hearing in 2 weeks to determine final custody arrangements and division of assets. Furthermore, Judge Whitfield had called a forensic specialist from the court to immediately freeze the offshore account, and the $127,000 in it would be held pending determination of how to divide it. Patricia said the judge had been furious, not just at Diane for the fraud, but at Jeffrey for putting on what she called a dog and pony show designed to obscure the truth. She'd apparently told Jeffrey in chambers that his conduct had been borderline sanctionable, and that she expected much better from an attorney of his reputation. When we went back into the courtroom, Judge Whitfield made her rulings on the record. She detailed the evidence of fraud and deception, and she didn't mince words about Diane's conduct. She noted that Diane had systematically lied to the court, had hidden assets while requesting alimony and support, had coached her children to make false statements, and had attempted to flee the country with marital funds. She said that such conduct demonstrated a fundamental lack of character and judgment that made Diane unfit for primary custody. She granted me primary physical custody, with final legal custody to be determined after the new evaluation. She denied all of Diane's requests for alimony and reduced her child support to a minimal amount pending further hearings. And she ordered Diane to pay my attorney's fees and the costs of the forensic investigation. Jeffrey tried to object, to request reconsideration, to argue that the new evidence had been obtained improperly, but Judge Whitfield shut him down at every turn. She said the evidence was properly authenticated and had been timely submitted. She said if he had concerns about how it was obtained, he could raise them in a separate motion, but for now, she was ruling based on the facts before her. And the facts showed that his client had perpetrated a massive fraud on her husband, her children, and the court itself. When the judge finally adjourned, I sat there for a moment just processing what had happened. I'd won. Not just won, but won completely and publicly. Diane was crying openly now, and Jeffrey was packing up his materials with sharp, angry movements. People in the gallery were whispering, and I heard someone say something about that being the biggest courtroom reversal they'd ever seen. Patricia put her hand on my shoulder and said I'd done well, that holding back that evidence had been a gamble, but it had paid off in spectacular fashion. I walked out of the courthouse into bright October sunlight and stood on the steps for a minute just breathing. My phone rang, and it was Douglas, the forensic accountant, congratulating me on the outcome. He said he'd been watching remotely via the court's video system and had seen Judge Whitfield's face when she'd opened that envelope. He said in all his years of testifying, he'd never seen a case flip that dramatically. He also mentioned that the district attorney's office had already contacted him about the criminal investigation, and he'd be providing them with all his findings. Diane was looking at potential felony charges for fraud and forgery, each carrying sentences of 2 to 5 years. Thomas, the investigator, called next, saying he'd heard through the courthouse grapevine what had happened and wanted to congratulate me. He said he'd gotten into investigation work because he believed in finding the truth, and it was satisfying to see the truth actually matter in court. He also mentioned that he'd been contacted by David Langford's employer, a pharmaceutical company that had strict ethics policies. Apparently, someone had sent them information about David's affair with a married woman and his spending of company money entertaining her. David was currently under internal investigation and might lose his job. I went straight from the courthouse to Sophie and Lucas's school, where Patricia had arranged for me to pick them up immediately per the custody order. The school secretary had been notified by the court, and she gave me a sympathetic smile as she called them out of class. Sophie came out first, looking confused, and then Lucas appeared with his backpack half open and papers falling out. I hugged them both and told them they were coming home with me for good now. Sophie started crying and said she'd been so scared I was going to lose them forever. Lucas asked if Mom was going to jail, and I realized the kids had known more about what was happening than I'd thought. On the drive home, Sophie told me that Mom had been coaching her on what to say to the psychologist. Diane had told her to say that I worked all the time and never paid attention to them, that I got angry a lot, that she felt safer with Mom. Sophie said she'd felt terrible lying, but Mom had said it was necessary to keep the family together. I told her she'd done nothing wrong, that adults had put her in an impossible situation, and that she never had to lie for anyone ever again. Lucas said Mom had told him the same things, and that he'd also felt bad about lying. He asked if he was in trouble, and my heart broke a little. I told him he wasn't in trouble, that none of this was his fault, and that I loved him no matter what. The next few weeks were chaos. The district attorney's office filed criminal charges against Diane for 3 counts of forgery, 2 counts of fraud, and 1 count of perjury. Jeffrey withdrew as her attorney, citing conflict of interest now that there were criminal charges involved. Diane hired a criminal defense lawyer, some guy who specialized in white-collar crime, and he immediately started working on a plea deal. Meanwhile, Diane's sister was under investigation for her role in setting up the offshore account, and she'd hired her own lawyer and was apparently cooperating with prosecutors to avoid charges herself. The custody evaluation was completed by a different psychologist, a man named Dr. Leonard Hayes, who had 30 years of experience and a reputation for being thorough and impartial. He interviewed Sophie and Lucas separately, interviewed Diane and me separately, visited both our homes, and reviewed all the court documents, including the evidence of Diane's fraud and coaching of the children. His report was devastating for Diane. He concluded that she had demonstrated a pattern of deception and manipulation, that she had inappropriately involved the children in adult conflicts, and that she had prioritized her own interests over the children's well-being. He recommended that I be granted sole legal and physical custody, with Diane receiving only supervised visitation until she could demonstrate that she'd addressed her behavioral issues through therapy. Judge Whitfield adopted Dr. Hayes' recommendations in full. I got sole custody. Diane got supervised visits twice a week for 2 hours each time, supervised by a court-appointed monitor who she had to pay for. The divorce was finalized with Diane receiving nothing. No alimony, minimal child support that was offset by the money she owed me, no share of my business, and only a small share of the equity in our house after accounting for the debt she'd created. The offshore account was split with me getting 75% and Diane getting 25%, and that 25% went directly to paying down the debts she'd incurred. In the end, Diane walked away from our 11-year marriage with almost nothing and a criminal record. The criminal case took longer to resolve, but eventually, Diane took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of forgery in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Her lawyer argued for probation only, but the prosecutor pointed out the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the breach of trust involved, and Judge Whitfield, who was also handling the criminal sentencing, agreed that prison time was appropriate. Diane cried during the sentencing hearing, and her lawyer read a statement about how she'd made terrible mistakes, but was taking responsibility. It rang hollow to everyone in the courtroom. David Langford lost his job with the pharmaceutical company after their internal investigation found that he'd violated company ethics policies and had used company resources for personal matters. He'd apparently been charging some of his dinners with Diane to his company expense account, claiming they were client meetings. He was fired without severance and was now working for a much smaller company making significantly less money. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Diane had fallen apart once the criminal charges were filed, and he realized he might get dragged into the mess as a witness. Jeffrey Ashworth faced professional consequences too. Several of his colleagues at his firm had been in the courtroom that day and had seen Judge Whitfield's rebuke about his conduct. Word spread through the legal community about how he'd tried to win a case through misdirection and stereotyping rather than facts, and how it had backfired spectacularly. He didn't lose his license or face formal sanctions, but his reputation took a hit. I heard from Patricia that he'd lost some major clients who were concerned about being associated with the case, and that his firm had quietly suggested he take some time off to let things blow over. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was doing better than I'd been in years. Sophie and Lucas had adjusted to living with me full-time, and we'd developed new routines that worked for all of us. I'd hired a part-time nanny to help with after-school care so I could still run my business, but I'd also cut back on my hours to make sure I was home for dinner every night and for important school events. The business was thriving. Apparently, my courtroom vindication had gotten some media coverage, and people in the community had rallied around me with new projects and referrals. I'd paid off most of the debt Diane had left me with, and I was rebuilding our savings. Diane was in prison serving her sentence, and Sophie and Lucas visited her once a month in the supervised prison visitation program. The visits were hard on them, but their therapist said it was important for them to maintain some relationship with their mother, while also understanding that her actions had consequences. Diane wrote them letters sometimes, apologizing for what she'd done and promising to be better when she got out. I didn't know if she meant it or if it was just more manipulation, but I let the kids read the letters and make up their own minds about their mother. As for me, I learned some important lessons from the whole nightmare. I learned not to blindly trust anyone with my finances, no matter how much I loved them. I learned to pay attention to red flags instead of rationalizing them away. I learned that honest work in jeans and boots was nothing to be ashamed of, no matter what people in expensive suits thought. And I learned that sometimes the best strategy is to let people underestimate you right up until the moment you prove them wrong with evidence they never saw coming. That manila envelope I pulled out in court that day became something of a legend in local legal circles. Patricia told me that law students studying family law were now being taught about the case as an example of how withholding key evidence until the optimal moment can change the entire trajectory of a trial. She said, professor at the local law school had even written an article about courtroom strategy that featured my case prominently. I'd become an accidental legal legend, the construction worker in work boots who outsmarted a high-powered attorney with a manila envelope. Jeffrey never spoke to me again after that day in court, but I heard he left his big downtown firm about a year later and went into solo practice doing much lower-profile work. I don't know if the case destroyed his career or just humbled him, but either way, he learned the same lesson I had. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance or background. The guy in jeans and work boots might just have evidence that destroys your entire case, and the smirk on your face might be the last confident expression you wear in that courtroom. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.